Hello, everyone. Welcome to Appalachian Ghost Stories, brought to you by Perry County Public Library and me, Miss Jessie Chandler, the Youth Services Librarian. It is spooky, scary Saturdays here in October, and I thought we could start off with some super creepy stories. So, are you ready to be scared? The first story we're going to read comes from Strange and Wonderful Things by Thomas L. Fries, a collection of ghost stories with special appearances by witches and other bizarre creatures. You can check this book out at the Perry County Public Library. And this is a Kentucky author. Morning Graves. Nobody with honorable intention wants to dig up the deceased. We all deserve a peaceful rest in the land of the dead. But sometimes coroners, police investigators, or suburban sprawl demands workers with backhoes dig up friends, family, or the forgotten. And if the coffin is forced open, we just hope there are no unpleasant surprises. Dust Devil spun across County Road 1570 in Franklin County, Kentucky, as a blue pickup followed curve after winding curve past hedge apple, elm, and walnut trees bordering the two-lane road. It was late, dry summer, and Malcolm Switzer drove to meet a new work crew at Cedar Lane Cemetery. Malcolm's thoughts drifted within his mind as his eyes watched the road for cars or farm tractors. But on a mid-September Thursday, early afternoon, there were no school buses or traffic at all. Malcolm was free to mull over the near-finished job of moving the little country cemetery. No one wanted to disinter the remains of 34 souls, but the best route for the water pipeline from the Ohio River to Lexington, going through 4 rural counties, had to go right through Cedar Lane. The cemetery, unlike most other graveyards in the country, was closer to a creek than a ridge. Tall cedar trees, gray bark and limbs storm broken below the 20 feet mark, marked the perimeter of the cemetery. The graves, at least those recognizable as markers, held back to 1827. No doubt there were older, unmarked plots amongst the outlying weeds, or lost below the dried green blue grass. Malcolm turned from the two-lane blacktop onto the gravel and dirt cemetery lane. A pair of county employees just began to dig into the last remaining plot. It was the grave of a friend, and Malcolm decided to wait in his truck and eat lunch before walking over to inspect the digging. Todd Johnson was buried 50 years before, when he and Malcolm were 12 years old. They played football together and spent many days hanging out, walking the big family farms not far from Cedar Lane. But friends who are close can have violent and sudden falling outs. Malcolm, one of the workers, was outside his truck, walking up to talk. Surprised, Malcolm set down his sandwich and opened his door. It was Tim Howe, who said, "We saw you there in your truck. We found something interesting just 4 feet down. Thought we ought to show you what's down there." Malcolm, with a look of concern, walked with Tim to the open rectangular hole. There was red clay earth piled to one side. He looked over the edge to see field stones lining the bottom. Tim took off his hat to wipe his forehead with the red faded bandana. "I sure don't know how those stones could have gotten down there. My father dug Todd's grave, and I can't imagine he would have put any stones on top of Todd's coffin. It's almost like someone dug in here sometime since then and put stones to keep him from getting out." The other digger, sitting in the backhoe, sat with a stone face, as smoke from his cigarette drifted into the blue September sky. He didn't lift an eyebrow. Malcolm stared into the grave, thinking about another September day 50 years before. Todd and he'd had a fight the week before, and Malcolm felt betrayed by Todd. Todd let slip a comment about Malcolm's interest in other boys. Malcolm decided that he had to stop a threat from ruining his life. Malcolm looked for powdered rat poison in his shed and put a pile of the deadly powder on a low crossbeam in his barn. Later that day, Malcolm lured Todd into the barn to play their jump from the hayloft game. But then Malcolm walked Todd over to show him a large wasp nest. When Todd bent close to look at the nest, Malcolm, from the other side of the beam, blew hard and the dust flew into Todd's face. Malcolm laughed hysterically, and Todd wasn't sure why his eyes stung and why he was coughing so hard. The next day, Todd was unable to respond at home or at the hospital, and the end came quickly. An autopsy revealed the poison, but no one ever suspected he was killed by Malcolm's calculated and cold-blooded actions. Malcolm pretended to grieve and soon put the incident behind him, finding a busy life in school, family, and career. He justified the murder as the necessary eliminating of the weak from a brutal society of have and have-nots. His flashback was interrupted as Tim's puzzled look on his face said, Malcolm? Malcolm looked up, startled back to the moment. Tim repeated the question that Malcolm didn't hear. Should we go ahead and clear out the stones, or do we need to call someone in on this? Malcolm quickly, vigorously shook his head back and forth. No need to call anyone. Just clear out the rocks and get the coffin up. We've got to have the land cleared by tomorrow morning. Tim shrugged as the other man restarted the backhoe. Malcolm looked a bit dazed, walked back to his truck, and drank some coffee. As the men pulled out rock after rock, Malcolm wondered about what Todd's life might have been like if he'd lived. He shuddered at the thought that he might have lost his good life if he didn't silence his friend. Malcolm looked over past the backhoe to see Todd's limestone monument leaning against the cedar. For a moment he thought he saw Todd himself sitting on the tombstone. Malcolm froze, foamed coffee cup almost to his lips. He watched the image fade, sure it was a memory from long ago, but the hot coffee did little to take an odd chill he felt, a chill to his bones. Malcolm was again lost in his thoughts, not realizing how much time it took the two men to clear rocks and pull the coffin out of the ground. The sun, as if it waited by the sorrow of souls, being removed from the resting place, hung sadly toward the western hills. He quickly got out of his truck, walking back to the gravesite. There was a very stiff breeze now, gusts swaying the cedar trees in circles. Tim noted, Sure looks like rain will be coming in tonight. We got this digging done just in time. The other workers started to steer the backhoe over to the flatbed truck near the county road. You gonna wait then on the hearse? 'Cause Kane and I need to get the truck and backhoe back to Frankfort now. Malcolm stared at the coffin. He felt this was his moment of truth. He felt a perverse need to open the coffin, talk to Todd's dead body, and either apologize or make excuses. It didn't make sense, what does make sense in our but what does make sense in our lives? They heard Kane honk the horn for Tim to go. Yeah, sure, it's running late. I'll wait here. Malcolm barely glanced aside at Tim, who waved and walked to the flatbed truck. Malcolm's eyes were fixed on Todd's coffin. You stupid bastard, Malcolm thought. Why didn't you keep your mouth shut? For all these years I've kept a secret that has nearly made me crazy. Malcolm looked up, seeing the men disappeared down the county road, headed east to Frankfort. I've got a good hammer in my truck. I'm going to open this coffin. Malcolm walked back toward his blue truck. The dust spun around him as he reached inside his truck to grab his hammer. No one needs to know about the rocks, Malcolm thought. No one needs to know I killed you. Malcolm smiled, and just then a gust of wind pushed his head against the truck door. It gashed his forehead, and he stumbled back, ignoring his bleeding head, to walk against a wild wind back to the coffin. It seemed that clouds came from nowhere, and he thought he heard a rumble of thunder. Malcolm swallowed hard in his dry throat, pausing before prying open the coffin. He looked again at Todd's gravestone, not believing he saw a rat perched on top. Must be blood from my forehead dripping into my eyes. Malcolm worked feverishly to pry open the old coffin before sunset ended. Orange light lit up the cedar trees, and the wind seemed to hold its breath while he leveraged the lid open. The coffin was out of the grave hole and rested on top of the ground, gray and black, but turning red and violet as the sun threw its last rays to the west. He pushed over the heavy lid, staring in disbelief at the empty coffin. Malcolm saw only dust, a gray dust, in the form of a man. How could the bones have turned to powder so quickly? Malcolm nearly shouted aloud. Just then a wicked cold wind whipped the entire pile of remains upward, flinging the death powder into Malcolm's face. No, Malcolm screamed, clutching his face, and falling backwards over the fresh pile of earth. He lay backwards, blinded from the deadly powder, choking and then turning over to try and throw up. Malcolm raised himself, intending to run to his truck to get water and splash it over his face. He dashed blindly from between the cedar trees, directly into the hearse's front grill. People say that Malcolm, discovering the empty coffin of his friend, went crazy with unresolved grief. People commented on how tragic it was that Malcolm was killed by the hearse, as the Cedar Lane Cemetery claimed one more dying soul. People wondered about the boyhood bond between Todd and Malcolm. People don't know the half of it. Our next spooky story comes from Spookiest Stories Ever, Four Seasons of Kentucky Ghosts, by Roberta Simpson Brown and Lonnie E. Brown. The foreword by Elizabeth Tucker. and you can check this Kentucky book out at the Perry County Public Library in our nonfiction section under 398.209. The story that we're going to talk today about is The Night of the Hook Moon. On the night of the hook moon, the sky is inky black, except for the moon's little sliver of light. It is curved like a hook and hangs low, maybe waiting, some say, to hook the spirit of a restless soul and pull it back from the grave. Jim was a believer in the power of the hook moon. Everybody was surprised when Jim told this story because he didn't seem the sort who could be frightened. But Jim didn't hesitate to admit that this night instilled such fear in him that he was always respectful of the dead after his experience, and he avoided new graves on nights of the hook moon. That particular night began uneventfully. Jim and his friend Marvin gave little thought to the moon when they mounted their horses and rode down Sano Road to a friend's house to gamble. This was a common practice among Jim's group of friends, even though gambling was frowned upon in his little community. On nights when the weather was good and the moon was bright, the men often built a fire outside and gambled by lantern until dawn. This night was dark because of the hook moon, so a bachelor friend had offered his house to the gamblers for the meeting. To them it was harmless fun, and a way of picking up a few extra dollars. The Sano Road ran down a little hill across a narrow creek that was shallow enough to cross without a bridge, and then up past the Sano church and graveyard. Deep woods covered several acres behind the church, and the cries of wildcats, called painters or panthers by local people, could be heard at times from those woods at night. But tonight there was silence. Maybe it was nature's way of paying respect to old Aunt